Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Stories from Friends. Tonight is part 2 in a 4-part series. Didn't catch part 1? No problem. You can enjoy tonight's storyteller without having watched the first part in our series. If you are interested in watching part 1, I will put a YouTube link to our first storyteller in the chat box. Tonight we are joined by local storyteller Solveig Eggerz for an evening of oral storytelling for adults. At the conclusion of Solveig's stories, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box or the Q&A box. Now I would like to introduce tonight's storyteller, Solveig Eggerz. Solveig Eggerz is the author of 2 novels, Seal Woman, inspired by the Selkie legend, and Sigga of Reykjavik, based on the history of 20th century Iceland. A native of Iceland, she has lived in Alexandria since 1974, where she tells stories and teaches creative writing for Herd, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing art to underserved populations. Please join me in welcoming Solveig Eggerz.
Thank you, Hannah, for that glowing introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. I'm so thrilled that you are here to share my reflections and create some reflections of your own. First of all, I want to tell you that recently I reread Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And I started listening to interviews with her, and a concept kept coming up. And it was the concept of being a rainbow in someone's cloud. And she referred to particular people in her family or in her larger extended family who were the rainbows in her cloud. And these were not just people who brought a smile to her face. These were people who really helped her survive. And that got me thinking about my whole life and about all the people who have passed through and all the people I've tried to learn things from. So when I was 16, I returned to Iceland, my native country. My parents at that time were living in Germany, and I went there to go to high school and to learn the language and put down roots with my relatives. And consequently, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother at my grandmother's house. This was my father's mother, and also living there was my father's sister, Erna, my aunt Erna. And they lived in this little house on Suðurgata. And Suðurgata starts downtown and it goes south all the way to the ocean. And their house was a wooden house with corrugated siding and a corrugated iron roof, which was in style for certain buildings at a certain time in Iceland. Right across the street was Gamli Kirkjugarðurinn, the old graveyard. So there was always a lot of traffic because people were always visiting people there, and there were always a lot of cars driving past. Every day at lunch, Erna would come home at 12:08. She left her work at the bank at noon, and it took her 8 minutes to walk. My grandmother did all the cooking. She usually made fish and potatoes. She was a fabulous cook. It was always exactly the same and always involved a lot of butter. On special days, she made something called blomkál gratin, cauliflower au gratin, we would call it. And even that had a lot of butter on it. So we sat in the dining room and ate, but in the living room was the radio. And this was called Hádegisútvarpið, the noon radio. And we could hear it. We could hear the news, domestic and foreign, as we ate. And as we ate our dessert, the shipping news came on, which is one of my favorites. And Erna, my aunt Erna, used that to teach me geography, the geography of the whole island, because this nice man with this very deep voice told us where every single Icelandic owned fishing boat, all the way up to passenger ships, was located at the time, including what fishing grounds they were on. This was very important, actually, for everybody to know, and I loved it. So after lunch, my grandmother shooed us into the living room, and this is where Aunt Erna proceeded to teach me everything that she knew. Our favorite thing was to listen to the weather report. And before I started living in Iceland, I always thought that the weather was about temperature either going up or down, or the question of whether it was sunny or rainy or snowing, something like that. I didn't realize that the key to Icelandic weather was changeability. And what direction was it going to change? And I didn't realize that the other key things were the direction of the wind, suðaustanátt, norðaustanátt, and also the strength of the wind. All of this Erna loved explaining to me. And so we'll start with andvari. Andvari is a very gentle breeze. Að anda is to breathe. And so you can imagine this was very, very soft and sweet, the andvari, which is a rare occasion actually in Icelandic weather. Gola, now that's a little brisker, now we're getting into wind. But my favorites were stinningskaldi, and that's already 6 on the weather scale. And the next one was strekkingur. So by the time you get to strekkingur, you start losing your hat, your hair starts flying straight back, and your raincoat starts flapping around. So I thought this was all very, very poetic. These words were so pretty. But backing up a little bit to the least likely kind of situation in Iceland, and that is called logn, Logn, and this literally means no wind at all. And if it's raining, rigning, at the same time as you have logn, the rain comes straight down. And as Erna said, alveg eins og í útlöndum, just like in foreign countries, because in Iceland, everything was always moving. And so when Erna left to go at 8 minutes to 1 to go to work, it was raining, but she didn't take an umbrella with her. In fact, nobody uses an umbrella in Iceland because unless you have logn, that rarity, your umbrella will just go inside out. So that was the weather. And when she came, I think she thought about this all day. She worked in the bank, the other bank. There was a Landsbanki and Útvegsbanki, and she was in Útvegsbanki. And when she came home, she said, okay, now we're going to meet your grandfather. He had passed away in 1945, so this meant going to the graveyard. And so we headed out in the rain down the muddy path that lay between all the gravestones there until we came to a tall pink marble gravestone that said Sigurður Eggerz, 1875 to 1945. Now, Sigurður, the nickname for Sigurður is Siggi. All of you who know Siggi's yogurt would know then that this is where the origin of the name. My grandfather was never called Siggi. He was called Sig. And Aunt Erna started talking about her father, and I knew by her tone of voice that how much she admired him. So standing there in the rain, we talked about Vik, where she was born in 1909, and my father was born in 1913. Vik is the southernmost tip of Iceland. It comes down like this. And the ocean is really, really wild there. I think it might be because it's coming from 2 directions at the same time. But this white surf crashes on the black sand there. As a consequence, there's because of sandbars, they were never able to build an harbor there. So the way they delivered goods was Danish ships would come along, merchant ships, and they would sit anchored out off the coast, and then the Icelandic men would go on rowboats and fetch it. a very, very dangerous situation. There were always a lot of drownings. And my my grandfather found this very, very emotional being there. He wrote a lot about it. One horrible day, the storm just wouldn't stop, and there was never a large enough gap in the waves to get the boat out. They had to do it anyway because the merchant ship was threatening to leave, and the rowboat ended up capsizing, and 7 men died that day. And Erna told me all of this while we're standing out there in the rain, thinking about her father. And she's told me that he went home and he said he couldn't, there was nothing he could do. This was a terrible tragedy. And he wrote a hymn to be sung at the funeral. They didn't have any time to put music to it, so they put it to the Polish national anthem, and so they sang this hymn in the church there for these men. As soon as we got home, Edna was still thinking about her father. No problem, because we had there was a huge portrait of him on the wall, and that portrait today hangs on my wall. But Edna started looking around in her things, and she found at the back of a shelf this bowl, and she brought it out in this reverential manner. It was orange and blue, and it was very beautiful. And she said, "This bowl, I really love this bowl. Mér þykir svo vænt þessa skál, because the people of Vik gave it to your grandfather when he left out of gratitude for his service." So there, she had told me that important bowl, and it wasn't made in Iceland. She said it's an import. So very carefully, she put it on the shelf, pushed it towards the back. Aunt Erna was still talking about the weather after we had looked at the bowl, and she told me then, we sat down and had some coffee, and she told me that, the weather of Iceland is so incredibly important. It is important to all of Europe. In fact, during World War II, the weather was a form of intelligence. There was a consul from Germany. He would send the Reykjavik weather report back to Germany, because that way the U-boats that were circling Iceland and torpedoing Allied shipping during World War II could know what kind of weather to expect because of how the Icelandic weather report sounded. Well, no sooner had she mentioned World War II than I became very excited, because I knew that she had been in her early 30s in World War II. I was born towards the end of World War II in Iceland, but we left Iceland, so I knew nothing of what happened there. But I did learn that the place was filled with Allied soldiers because it was occupied, and that there was this constant violence in the North Atlantic because of the U-boat torpedoes. And then Erna told me, yeah, but then, when they had all that violence going on, and then a German plane would fly over, and then we would all have to go to these shelters. Now, at this time, Erna lived in an apartment in the eastern part of town, and she was already working at the bank. And so I asked her, so, German plane flies over, you never know how that's going to end, right? And she said, yeah, you never know. And then I said, well, did you put on your bathrobe and run to the basement or what? Nay, 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 alls ekki, no. I just turned over and went back to sleep. And I was amazed at that. That choice just sounded so bizarre to me. And so I said, why? Why did you do that? And you weren't afraid? She said, yes, I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. But I had to make a choice. I couldn't lose sleep. If I was there half the night down in that basement, I'd be no good at the bank the next day. And so I realized that she was very decisive and was constantly making these unusual choices. And in this case, she chose not to be afraid. After my grandfather died in 1945, Aunt Erna moved into this little house with her mother, where we are having this conversation that I'm telling you about now. And with this little house, there was a garden. And there was a little garden in the back. It was a pretty little garden. And Aunt Erna grew pansies in the garden. And there were bushes there, red currant bushes, black currant bushes. And she picked those currants, and my grandmother made jam out of those. Because the garden was contiguous to other gardens, little children who lived around noticed Aunt Erna in the garden, and they somehow managed to slip either through the fence or climb over the fence, because she said, every now and then I would look up and this little person would be sitting next to me. And of course, I would just smile at them and I would put them to work weeding. And then afterwards, as a reward, they would come in for hot chocolate and cookies. She loved children, and they understood that, and they loved her back. And they looked for her. And she told me this story about one of her fans. There was a knock on the door, and she opened the door, and there was this little girl. And she recognized the little girl from the garden, but she couldn't remember her name. And the little girl was holding a box. And the child said, "Fyrir þig, Erna, it's for you, Erna." And she was smiling so proudly. And the way Erna told it was, I took the box. It was a little bit heavy, but I saw that child smiling and waiting for me to open it. So I took off the lid, and I looked down, and here was this large clay thing. It was brown clay thing. And I lifted it up, and I turned it over, and there was a clasp on the back. Oh my goodness, it was a pin. And then the little girl said, "I made it for you in school." Oh my gosh, I knew this was important. So I just said, "Oh, it's beautiful." It was really very ugly. And then the little girl said, "Erna, you just pin it on your silk dress so when you will go to the opera." "Oh, yes," I said. "Yeah, my silk dress." And I had to think fast. I had to think of something better that would make both of us happy. So I said, "Oh, you know what? This is much too beautiful to pin on my dress once a year when I go to the opera. I am going to pin this on my curtain so that in my bedroom, and when I wake up in the morning, I will see your pin right there. It'll be the first thing I'll see in the morning." And the little girl smiled. And Aunt Erna said, "Do you want to come in for some hot chocolate and cookies?" And they both went in and they celebrated the pin. After she finished telling me that, Aunt Erna said, "There's a poem that I keep in my heart, and it helps me to not be mean to other people." And it goes like this: "Aðgát skal höfð í nærveru sálar." Exercise caution in proximity of a soul. And I always remember that, especially when I see a little child who's made an ugly pin for me. So I had been watching Aunt Erna a lot, and I was just a young person looking for a model in life. And I was fascinated by her. And I was fascinated by her cheerful nature. And I finally brought myself to ask her the question, Erna, hefur þú alltaf verið svona glöð? Have you always been this cheerful? Nei, alls ekki. she said. And then she told me that when she was approximately 45 years old, she decided, she said, she decided to no longer be grumpy, to stop complaining, and just be cheerful. I was stunned by that. I just couldn't believe it. I had never met anybody like that. I didn't know that you could just decide to be cheerful. I had no idea. I thought you just were born either glad or you were born sad, and that was it. And so I decided I have to find the key to understanding Aunt Erna. Who is she? How did she become who she is? Is it all just from deciding, making choices? I knew she made a choice to sleep through World War II, but gosh, deciding to be cheerful, that is amazing. That is amazing. Well, she herself gave me a clue when she told me about a conversation that she had with my father. Now, she loved talking about my father, and I think she really loved my father. He was her baby brother, 4 years younger, but he was very different from her. He had a deadpan humor, and he was very precise, and she had a ha 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 humor. And so they were very different, and they had a hard time understanding one another. Well, this is how Edna told me the story. You know, we had us, and there were some relatives we had. They were destitute, or let's say they were very poor. And the gossip was that the reason they were poor was their own fault. Why? They didn't like to work, and they liked to drink. Well, I felt sorry for them, and I decided to lend them money on a regular basis. And that was my business. It was my money. But your father heard about it, and he took me aside, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, "Þetta fólk, það borgar þér aldrei." Notice aldrei is from deep in the throat. It means never. Aldrei aftur. Those people, they will never pay you back. I just looked at him. Did he really say that? I don't know. He must have meant it since he said it. And then I said to him, "Pétur, það bara peningar." Peter, it's only money. And that was my clue. That was my clue to the power of only. So I just wonder if any of you have ever noticed the power of the word only, that most of us think of it as just a nothing word, but for Erna, it was infused with power. Years later, after I was finally grown up, and I lived in Alexandria, Virginia with my family. And Aunt Erna, she loved my kids. She loved all kids. And so she came to visit us every spring for about 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, she said, "I've got to go home to the podiatrist. I have an appointment." And she left. But it was very brave of her because she was afraid of flying. And she also was not a real fan of animals in the house. We had 2 dogs and a cat. And I visited her every summer. One summer I was at her house with my 2 older children. They were at that time 3 years old and almost 2. My grandmother had passed away, so it was only Aunt Erna living in the house. And what had happened was that morning, on this particular day, was my little son had become very excited about the framed photographs of beloved relatives that were all over the room. And he liked to pick them up and look at them very closely and then drop them on the floor. So Aunt Erna and I decided we should just sweep the room clean of all framed photographs, which we did. And so we were tired, and we were standing together in the doorway between the dining room and the living room. Aunt Erna and I and my little boy, who held my leg with one arm and his pink blanket with the other arm. And then Aunt Erna said, "Oh, núna allt í lagi. Now everything is just fine." She felt like the place was childproof. But then she said, "Það bara einn hlutur í þessu herbergi. There is only one thing in this room." Note the word only, by the way. "Sem mér þykir vænt that I love." And of course, I thought she was going to say my name. I thought she was going to say my little boy's name. We were there, there were only 3 of us in the room. But no, she did not say that. Instead, she leaned her forehead like this forward a little bit, sideways, and she said, "Það skálin þarna." And I saw it then, that orange and blue bowl that she had shown me years ago, and I'd never thought of since. There it was, the bowl that my grandfather had gotten from the people in Vik, the bowl that she loved so much. And the weird thing is that it was as if her words, spoken in Icelandic, triggered something in my little boy, because he let go of my leg and he ran across the room. He was just a blur. I didn't have room to scream, and he was waving his blanket, and he went straight for the bowl, and he picked up the bowl and he dropped it. Crash. Nothing but orange and blue pieces remained on the carpet. And he came running back. He was afraid of the sound, and he grabbed my leg and he was trembling. Well, so I just felt guilt and shame and horror. How could I let this happen? And the bowl was broken and it was irreplaceable. She had told me how much she loved it. And I felt her next to me. I felt her lean against me. I felt her freeze against me, stiffen up. And she glanced at my little boy. She looked at the pieces, and then she looked out the window. And looking out the window, you can see the pond, and then you can see the eastern part of town that goes on forever. And she was just looking out forever there. And we stood there just breathing in and out, the 3 of us there, for several seconds, until I felt her standing next to me, her body relax. And she said, "Það var bara skál. It was only a bowl." And we never spoke of that again. But that night, as I lay in my bed under the eaves, listening to the ping, 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 ping of the rain as it pelted the corrugated iron roof, and I heard the rattling of the wind in my partially open window, and I could smell the ocean and the fish, all that smell coming in. I thought of the power of that word, only. It had the power of choice in it. Erna had made a choice. I'm so glad she made the choice that she made. But there was also the power of forgiveness in that word, only. I was amazed. I was just amazed. Many years later, it was 2014, and I was at a retreat on the west coast of Ireland, an artist retreat. And one evening, my friends and I, we decided to go to the theater. That is, we were we went to hear a stand-up comedian in a small fishing village next to where we were living. And it was a lovely place with boats everywhere, and the sun was still out. And the way it was set up was the theater was downstairs, and there was a art gallery upstairs. So we sat down at a round table, and the comedian, whose name was John, came in, and he was very loud. He roared all these jokes in this Irish brogue, and I could barely understand it. I was straining to get it, and all the Irish people around us were roaring with laughter and screaming, "Oh, the Irish, the Irish," she kept saying, "Oh, the Irish are so funny." And they cheered and clapped, and they loved hearing these jokes about Irish people. So we were all laughing and laughing. Finally, it was intermission. I was actually kind of relieved because suddenly it was very quiet. And a friend and I, we went out walking on the dock and looking at the boats. And then she said, "Why don't we go upstairs to the gallery and see what's up there?" "Good idea," I said. And up the stairs we went. The first thing I saw there was a long display shelf. I'm sure you've seen these in stores. And it had consisted of squares. And in each square was an item of pottery. And I walked past these pottery items, and I noticed that each one of them had a price on a little card that was 300 euros or more. So I walked past that shelf. I did not want to buy any pottery that evening. And then at the end of that pottery shelf was a jewelry display box that you could go up and you could look down. My friend was immediately attracted by the bracelets and the earrings. And I looked down, and I also decided I don't think I want any jewelry. So I stepped back because I didn't want to be tempted by the earrings. I stepped back, and my shoulder touched the display case, and it swayed. And all those little things in there, those potteries are going, woo. And then I heard topple. One of them seemed to have fallen, at least one had fallen over in its little square. And I prayed, don't go all the way to the floor. But it did, because I heard crash. Oh my gosh, I felt terrible. I felt so guilty. I felt so shamed. I walked around and looked at the little square where the item had been, and I saw the price was 340 euros. And I just stood there, and I had broken something in public. I don't know if that's happened to you. I don't know if you've ever broken anything in public, but it's a really bad feeling. And then somebody who must have been the owner appeared. "Jesus, Mary, and all the saints, you broke it. So obviously she was a little bit upset. And I immediately said, "I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry. But your shelf, it's not anchored. It's swayed. Let me show you." And I grabbed the end, and I went like this. And all those little items went, "Ooh," and she screamed, Stop. And I stopped, and nothing else broke. And she said, "Let's just forget about all this. Let's just forget about it." Now, obviously, she wanted me to leave. Well, I wasn't going to let her off that easily because I was feeling very bad. Well, she went down on all fours and scooped up the pieces, and she held them up like an offering. And she said, the problem is not the price. It's because this is one of a kind. It's irreplaceable, absolutely irreplaceable. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said. And then having lived in the US for several years, I thought I was in the habit of carrying a credit card with me for just such an occasion. So I pulled it out of my pocket and I extended it to her. And I said, just put 100 euros on it and we'll both feel better. And she said, oh, no, 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 I can't accept that. I can't accept that. And I had to get her to accept it. I had to do it. So I pushed it again towards her. She said, first she said, no, 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 no. And I kept going like this a little bit. And then she said, oh, okay, I'll accept 50. And I was very happy. I was overjoyed that she would take at least something. And she ran that card through the machine. And then she started to feel bad. And she said, oh, I feel so bad taking this. Please take something. Here, take this plate. And I said, no, 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 thank you. No, I wasn't going to let her reduce or add to the bad feeling I had. But she was relentless. And so I finally agreed to take 2 postcards. And she smiled and I smiled. And I held my 2 postcards. And I walked with my head up high, shoulders back to the steps. Until I was out of eyesight. And as soon as I was at the steps, I grabbed the railing with 2 hands and I limped down the steps. I've just felt so bad about the whole thing. And I went down and I rejoined my friends and at the table, and I just sat there with my eyes closed. And this time I couldn't understand a word of what the comedian was saying. Everybody was screaming and he was saying the Irish, and people were stomping and clapping. I had no idea what he was saying. But my friend, she put her arm around me and she said, don't feel bad. They always jack up the prices. At least in California they do. So I didn't feel any better at all. I just put my hands over my ears and sat there and waited for a better time. But then a voice came to me, a voice from so long ago. And the voice was, it was my Aunt Erna. And she said, "Það var bara skál." It was only a bowl. And I started to feel a little better. I knew I would not be forgiven for what happened upstairs, but it was so consoling to feel again that forgiveness that she gave me all those years ago. And I knew then that my Aunt Erna, she was the rainbow in my cloud. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those stories, Solveig. At this point, I would like to invite our audience to ask some questions. You can ask questions in the chat box, or you can ask questions in the Q&A box. The chat box is the one where I just put the link for next week's storyteller. Ruth Walkup will join us on May 4th at 7 p.m. I also put a link to the last storyteller in our list, Cheryl Mason, who's joining us on May 17th, and a video to Joyce Morgan Young's YouTube recording of our first performance that took place last week. While you type any questions you may have in that chat box or Q&A box, I just want to start by asking Solveig, how did you get into storytelling?
I'm pondering now whether to tell you the truth or not. My son my youngest child, who's not in this story, he went to St. Mary's part of the time. St. Mary's School here in Alexandria. We are not Catholic, and I was a little worried about putting him in a totally 100% Catholic school. So I decided to become a spy and just be in the building as often as I could. I had my close friend Paige Elliott was the librarian there, and I offered to do stories. I didn't know anything about storytelling, and I just started reading fairy tales and going in once or twice a week to tell. I told to all the kids for 8 years until my son graduated from St. Mary's. So that's the truth.
And I just wanted to ask about the teaching you do. I noticed that you teach with Herd. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Herd is a nonprofit that aims to bring the arts to underserved populations under the concept that everybody deserves to be heard. I usually teach in the jail, either in Alexandria or Arlington, but we haven't been able to go in there for over a year. But I teach also previously incarcerated women and whoever the various clients are that need to learn creative writing. That's my field, is creative writing. So I encounter wonderful writers every time I teach a class, whether it's in the jail or among other groups that are underserved. There's beautiful poetry, beautiful fiction, nonfiction. So it's a very giving thing in the sense that they give me a lot.
We do have an audience question. Valdo asks, did your Aunt Irma never marry? If she never had children of her own, do you think why she loved all other children so much?
Yeah, she never did marry. And of course, and she had no children either. But she, I don't know, maybe if she'd had children, she wouldn't have liked them so much. But she not only liked them, but she really enjoyed them. She enjoyed what they said. She listened to what they said. So it was that kind of thing. And as a consequence, those little kids who were gardening with her, they knew she was listening. They came because they wanted to talk to her, and they knew that, you know, she had that they had her ear. And so yeah, and that, I think that's the right answer, isn't it? That's the full answer. But so I think she overcame her fear of flying in order to visit us regularly. And she didn't like to, you know, be in other people's homes, staying for 2 weeks, but hey, she had to see those kids.
We have a comment from Jean. Lovely story. I've been to Iceland and loved the discussion of the wind. That was a lovely thought that at 45, she changed her mind.
Thank you, Jean. That's the concept that floored me most about my Aunt Erna, was when she said that. I remember exactly where we were standing actually when she said that. And now I almost fell over. It was so revolutionary.
I don't see any other audience questions, so I'm going to take a moment to remind everyone that our next storyteller will be Ruth Walkup on May 4th. Same bat time, same bat channel. So here on Zoom, that'll be this time next week, Tuesday, May 4th at 7 p.m. for the third part in our oral storytelling series, Stories from Friends. Thank you so much for joining us today, Solveig. Do you have any final words for our audience?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and listening. And I sensed you out there. And thanks for, you know, just, oh yes, do think about these two issues. Who is the rainbow in your cloud? Are you a rainbow in somebody's cloud? It's a lovely concept, and it just fit my aunt perfectly. And what was the other one? Try not to break anything in public.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for joining us on a Tuesday night. Thank you to our overseas audience who stayed up extra late to stay with us. I want you all to have a safe and healthy spring. Have a good night, everyone.